Over the Appalachian Ridges in October 2024, the air was thick and heavy. Something that wasn't bedrock was struck by a construction crew while breaking ground for a new shopping center on the outskirts of Beckley, West Virginia. A rusted backhoe blade slashed against the compacted red clay and wild kudzu vines 3 feet below. The license plate of a silver 1998 Honda Accord can be seen through the mud on the roof. WV4729L. The vehicle had been deliberately buried beneath what was once a coal loading site. Inside, forensic teams would discover 2 sets of remains: a child's pink backpack with the name Natasha stitched in fading purple thread, and a woman's wedding ring still circling a bone. Susan Carter and her 10-year-old daughter had been missing for 24 years. The community was under the impression that they had left an abusive marriage and started over somewhere else, away from the icy dust of southern West Virginia. However, the truth had always been hidden beneath their feet, waiting for a blade to break through the earth and allow them to speak at last. Who dug their graves, and why did it take the ground a quarter of a century to reveal its secret? Please subscribe and like this video before we continue this shocking tale. The algorithm gods will ensure that you don't miss any more uploads thanks to your support, which helps bring these forgotten stories to light. November 2024. Over the Appalachian Ridges, thick fog of the morning and the metallic scent of approaching rain filled the air. The town of Beckley in West Virginia prepared for another winter by carving from coal seams and hard labor. A construction crew arrived before dawn to break ground on a new shopping plaza on the eastern edge of town, where old rail yards once transported black diamonds from mountain bellies. A former coal loading station, overgrown with kudzu vines, wild sumac and red clay, hardened by 24 years of Appalachian weather, the site had been abandoned for decades. At 6:47 a.m., excavator operator Tommy Briggs got into his Caterpillar 320. The diesel motor coughing their way through the cold. He did a simple job: level the site and prepare it for concrete by clearing the top 3 feet of compacted earth. The backhoe's steel blade cut into the red clay of Virginia, sifting out pieces of rock, twisted roots, and rusted metal scraps that belonged to the rail yard's industrial past. Work was routine for 2 hours. The blade then struck something that didn't sound like stone at 8:52 a.m. Metal, hollow, large. Briggs killed the engine. The valley broke back into silence at once, broken only by a distant cough from the overhead crows. His boots sank into the muddy trench that his machine had dug as he got out of the cab. Something silver sparkled in the hazy morning light beneath a tangle of roots and clay. He sat down and used gloved hands to remove dirt. Paint, rusted but unmistakably automotive paint. Mud-covered but still legible, a license plate emerged. WV4729L. His heart rate increased. Briggs dialed the site foreman using his jacket-bound phone. In just 20 minutes, Beckley police showed up. Along the muddy access road, their cruisers were parked at odd angles. Yellow tape had been used by the West Virginia State Police to enclose the entire area by noon. In white Tyvek suits, forensic technicians carefully photographed, measured, and documented every angle of the half-buried vehicle. The backhoe's blade, which was still dripping with red clay, sat idle nearby. A silver-colored 1998 Honda Accord 4-door was the vehicle. It had been placed horizontally in a trench about 6 feet deep with the intention of being buried and then covered by layers of topsoil, gravel, and clay. Whether by accident or the weight of the earth, the roof had been crushed inward. The license plate was sufficient, but forensic engineers were unable to as of yet. Within minutes, the results of a records check arrived. Susan Marie Carter, registered owner, Beckley, West Virginia, is the last known address. Status, March 2000, missing person. The younger officers had no idea what the name was. However, for those who worked in Raleigh County at the beginning of the new millennium, it was like a ghost emerging from cold case files. Susan, on March 12, 2000. Carter, who was 41 years old at the time, and her 10-year-old daughter Natasha Carter vanished without a trace. As a case of voluntary disappearance, the case had been filed. a woman who takes her child with her as she flees an abusive marriage and starts over somewhere else other than the mountains. There was only a trailer that was empty, a car that had vanished, and a husband who claimed his wife had fled. There was no body, no crime scene, and no evidence of wrongdoing. The car had been found 24 years later, and it wasn't empty. Hydraulic jacks were used by forensic teams to carefully raise the Accord's shattered frame, slowly preserving any evidence that is still clinging to the metal and upholstery. They were first hit by the earthy mineral scent of bones and soil that had melded over decades. When the driver's side door was finally opened, this smell was not decay, which had already passed long ago. 2 sets of remains were inside, partially submerged in sediment that had penetrated the rusted seams. An adult female sits in the driver's seat. Her denim, synthetic fabric, and skeletal clothing remains visible, a blouse in a floral pattern. A bone was encircled the thin, green tarnished gold wedding band on her left third finger. A child's smaller remains are in the back seat. The bones were next to pink backpack fragments. The fading purple thread that was stitched into the rotted nylon fabric made it still recognizable. Natasha, a woman in her 50s who worked on dozens of cold cases, knelt next to the open door and stared at the name. She was a forensic technician. She was silent. A younger officer walked away from her behind her and handed her his tongue. The site had ceased to exist. The wind seemed to be holding its breath as well. The West Virginia State Medical Examiner's van arrived late in the afternoon, and the bodies were carefully removed, each bone cataloged, and each clothing fragment bagged and tagged. The wedding ring and the backpack dispelled any skepticism, even though the preliminary examination would take weeks. The Carters, Susan and Natasha, had not fled. They had always been here, buried beneath an abandoned industrial lot, and enclosed, beneath the layers of Appalachian soil, silence. A single detail that changed the case from tragedy to homicide emerged that evening. As the sun set over the ridges and cast long shadows over the excavation site, the exterior rear doors of the Honda Accord had been welded shut. Welds crude and rough, done quickly but effectively. They had been sealed inside and buried alive or shortly after death. Finally, the ground had opened, and Susan and Natasha Carter were able to communicate once more after 24 years. March 2000. Southern Western Virginia had winter in its bones despite the calendar's promise of spring. The gray hardwood and dark evergreen that covered the slopes of the mountains around Beckley remained bare. Every morning, thick, cold fog settled in the hollows and did not begin to lift until nearly noon. A narrow gravel path winds through scrub pine and muddy lots in the trailer park on Dry Branch Road. Shift work, disability benefits, and the gradual decline of Coal Town prosperity governed daily life. Lot 14 was where Susan Marie Carter lived, a wide trailer with a small wooden deck that sagged at one corner and faded blue siding. Despite her being 41 years old, neighbors frequently commented that she appeared older, the kind of aging that is caused by excess weight rather than years. Her eyes were narrow. She frequently had tired, pale blue eyes. She wore her brown hair in a practical ponytail that was pulled back. Her rough hands, which she had worked with for years, always had small cuts and dry skin that no amount of lotion could soften. She was a cashier at the Save-A-Lot. She had held for nearly 7 years, was working in a grocery store on Harper Road.
She worked 5 days a week from 7 a.m. to 3 p.m., sometimes 6 when they needed more help. She was described as trustworthy, quiet, and never late by managers. She did not attend the occasional Friday night gatherings at the bowling alley and did not engage in a lot of socializing with coworkers. She clocked out at the end of her shift, walked to her silver Honda Accord in the employee parking lot, and drove back 4 miles to Drive Ranch Road. In March 2000, daughter Natasha Lynn Carter was 10 years old. She went to Beckley Elementary, a low brick building surrounded by a chain-link fence and a playground. She was described by her teachers as shy and distant, the kind of child who sat at the back of the class and rarely spoke. But when she did speak, she was courteous and careful, as if she were checking the safety of each syllable. Art was her favorite subject. She loved to draw horses, wild horses running across open fields, their manes flowing with no contact with the ground. Mrs., her teacher, A pencil sketch of Natasha's mare and foal standing beneath a tree was pinned to Patricia Holcomb's bulletin board for months. Natasha had the narrow face and pale eyes of her mother, but her summertime hair was lighter and almost blonde. She wore sweatshirts that were an oversized size and secondhand jeans with patches on the knees. Her mother sewed her name in purple thread and decorated her pink backpack with fabric markers. She carried school books, a battered notebook full of horse drawings, and a small stuffed bear named Charlie, whose smooth fur had been held for years. Although small, the trailer on Lot 14 was clean. Susan maintained that state. Dish soap and stale coffee filled the air in the kitchen. The couch's back was covered by a yellow crocheted blanket. Natasha's drawings were held in place by magnets on the refrigerator. Always horses, of course. The walls were so thin that every sound could travel from one end to the other, from one side of the trailer to the other, so the neighbors could hear everything. Susan's husband, Michael Joseph Carter, was 44 years old. Prior to his 1997 disability due to a back injury, he had worked in the coal mines for 15 years. He was a big man with broad shoulders, calloused hands, and a face that appeared to be fixed in a scowl all the time. He spent the majority of his days either at home or at Smokey's Bar, a cinder-block structure on Route 3, with neon beer signs in the windows. He drank Budweiser, played pool, and complained loudly about his pain, his back, the ineffective doctors he had, and his wife, who didn't care a whit. Dry Branch Road neighbors were familiar with Michael Carter's voice. Loud, slurred, and enraged, it passed through the trailer's thin walls on too many nights. They heard glass breaking, doors slamming, Susan's voice quieter, pleading, and sometimes Natasha crying. The police were not contacted. In the trailer park, things didn't work that way. People were focused on their tasks. They shut their windows, turned up their televisions, and pretended to be silent. Carol Jenkins, on the other hand, who lived in Lot 12, 2 trailers down, noticed more than anyone else. She had sharp eyes and was a heavy-set, gray-haired retired nurse. When Susan brought groceries from her car, she noticed the bruises on her arms. She saw Natasha hunched over and staring down as she made her way to the stop for the school bus. Carol stopped Susan one morning in late February 2000 while she was loading her daughter into the Honda. "Honey, are you all right?" Carol asked in a low voice. Susan tried to smile, but it didn't go to her eyes. "Fine, just worn out." Susan drove off before she could say anything else because Carol didn't believe her. Linda Moss, the school nurse at Beckley Elementary, noted Natasha's concerns in her file. A dark purple bruise appeared on the left forearm on February 8, 2000. The student claims she went off her bike. During gym class on February 22, a bruise on the right shoulder blade was visible through the shirt. When asked, the student became enraged and refused to explain. The notes were kept. A social worker was supposed to follow up, but Beckley's Department of Health and Human Resources was short on staff and had a lot of cases. The follow-up was never carried out. Susan was aware that she had to go. She had known for a long time, but there was a canyon of fear and logistics that separated knowing from doing. She would go where? How would she manage to pay rent? Their bank account was under Michael's control. In a coffee can, hidden behind the water heater, she had $240 in cash. She had been slowly adding to it, $5 here, $10 there, whenever she could steal money from her grocery bill without his knowledge. She confided in her sister, Margaret Hayes, who lived 30 miles away in Princeton, at a beginning of March. While Natasha ate a Happy Meal in the back seat of Susan's car, they met in a McDonald's parking lot. With barely a whisper in her voice, Susan declared, "I'm going to leave him. I can no longer do this. He is deteriorating." Margaret held on to her sister's arm. "You and I can stay together. Leave tonight. Pack your bags." Susan gave a head shake. "He'll find me. He will, you know. I must properly plan it, get away from him far enough that he can't follow." Margaret shed a tear in her eyes. "Please come now. It's been 2 weeks." "I need 2 weeks. I'll get my back taxes. I'll have enough money to put down a down payment on an apartment. Maybe North Carolina. Maybe Ohio." Margaret nodded because she knew that her sister's fear was real, even though she did not want to wait. Michael Carter had made it abundantly clear that he had a temper, once that he would ensure that Susan regretted her decision if she ever attempted to leave. Susan withdrew $180 from the bank on March 10, 2000, 2 days before she disappeared, in order to have her tax refund deposited earlier. She told the cashier that she was buying new school uniforms for Natasha. She went to a Goodwill store and purchased 3 outfits for Natasha, 2 for herself, and a duffel bag for herself. She tucked the bag under a wool blanket and an unworn spare tire in the trunk of her car. She prepared Natasha's favorite dinner that same evening. Natasha didn't like tomatoes, so she made butter and Parmesan spaghetti without sauce. Michael sat in the living room, half asleep in his recliner, an empty beer can on the armrest. While they ate together at the small kitchen table, Susan watched her daughter swirl noodles with her fork. Natasha spoke quietly. "Mama, is there a destination in sight?" Susan gasped for air. "Why are you asking that?" "In the car I saw the bag." Susan extended her hand across the table to her daughter. "Maybe sometime soon. Would that satisfy you?" Natasha nodded with wide, hopeful eyes. "Can we accompany horses somewhere?" Susan smiled. It was real for the first time in months. "Yes, child." 2 days later they were no longer there, somewhere with horses. 3. Capitulo Desaportio 12th, March 2000. Sunday. The sky over Beckley was low and gray, indicating that rain would not arrive until after dark. The temperature was in the low 40s, which was cold enough that one could smell their breath in the morning air. Fog remained covering the mountains, clung to the crevices like something unable to move and refused to lift. The day felt like it had been suspended. Neither spring nor winter was caught in between. Even on Sunday, Susan Carter always awoke at 6:30 a.m. The trailer wasn't loud. The previous night, shortly after midnight, Michael had returned home smelling of beer and cigarettes.
The loud snoring he was still doing in their bedroom could be heard through the thin walls. With care, Susan avoided the spots on the creak in the floor. Standing at the counter as she brewed her coffee in the small kitchen, she took in the gray morning outside through the window. At 7:15, Natasha still wore her faded pink pajamas with cartoon bears on them when she came out of her room. She was carrying Charlie, the stuffed bear, tucked under one arm, and her hair was tangled from sleep. While she was eating, Susan sat with her at the table and served her a bowl of Cheerios and milk. They barely exchanged words. The morning appeared fragile, as though speaking too loudly might break something. Michael awoke at 9 in the morning. From the bedroom to the bathroom, they heard his deliberate, heavy footsteps. The toilet flushed and the water ran. Unshaven, with bloodshot eyes, he appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing sweatpants and a stained t-shirt. He said, "Coffee," without looking at Susan. She gave him a black cup and set it on the counter for him. Standing in front of the window she had been watching earlier, he drank it. The three of them briefly resided in nervous silence, Natasha slowly spooning cereal, Michael at the counter, and Susan at the table. He spoke next. He stated, "I'm going outside. Ray said he needs help and is working on his truck." Susan gave a nod. "Okay." After patting his pockets for his cigarettes and wallet and grabbing his jacket from the hook by the door, Michael left without speaking. After him, the door slammed shut. Susan saw his rusted Ford F-150 pickup truck drive out of the gravel driveway and down a dry branch road from the window. She sat for 5 minutes. She then looked over at Natasha. "Baby, get dressed. We are leaving." Natasha gave a wide-eyed upturn. "Where?" "Merely for a drive, perhaps get ice cream." Natasha was aware that ice cream was out of the question. However, she did not argue. She changed into her worn sneakers, purple sweatshirt and jeans when she got to her room. Susan donned her own jeans, a blouse with a floral print, and a denim jacket. She took her purse from the counter, looked inside, and found the $240 in cash folded into a wallet and keys, tiny envelope. She was shaking her hands. Susan and Natasha left the trailer at 10:05 a.m. The neighbor in Lot 12, Carol Jenkins, was outside sweeping her small porch. As Susan drove the silver Honda Accord out of the driveway, she waved. With a short, tight smile, Susan waved back. Carol would later report to the police that Susan appeared uneasy, distracted, and not herself, but at the time she didn't care. It took 12 minutes to drive into Beckley. With both hands on the wheel, Susan drove cautiously while checking her rearview mirror more frequently than is required. With her pink backpack on her lap,
Natasha sat in the back seat. Charlie, the bear inside, was hidden. She looked at the window and saw the gray mountains, no trees, and occasionally a house that was set back from the road. Susan pulled into the 7-Eleven parking lot on Harper Road at 10:23 a.m., 2 blocks from the Save-A-Lot where she worked. The silver Honda was captured on time-stamped, grainy security footage approaching Pump 3. After getting out, Susan started filling the tank by using her debit card. Natasha continued to sit there in the back seat, as seen through the window in the rear. The camera's profile shot of Susan's face appeared drawn and pale. As if looking for someone, she kept glancing toward the road. Susan entered the building after the tank was full. She was clearly remembered by the on-duty clerk, Derek Palmer, a 19-year-old working weekends to pay for community college. Despite the fact that she rarely smoked, she bought Natasha a bag of Skittles, a bottle of water, and a pack of Marlboro cigarettes. She deposited cash. He noticed that her hands were shaking as Derek handed her the change. "Are you fine, ma'am?" he inquired. As if she had forgotten he was there, Susan gave him a startled look. "All right, just cold." She then left with the plastic bag. Derek followed her as she made her way to the vehicle, got in, and sat down before starting the engine. She did not leave immediately. With her hands on the wheel, she sat there and stared straight ahead. She then left the parking lot at 10:31 a.m. and turned left onto Harper Road in the direction of Route 3. That was Susan and Natasha Carter's last known sighting. Although Derek Palmer's testimony would become crucial in later years, in March 2000, it was just another Sunday morning transaction. The security footage was recorded over after being kept for 30 days. A box contained thousands of other receipts. It was not preserved in any way. Michael Carter remained at Ray Dawkins' small cinderblock residence 3 miles from the park for trailers. Rye, a wiry man in his 50s with greasy hands and a crooked smile, was working on his truck, a Chevy Silverado, with a broken transmission. Michael held tools, assisted Ray in raising the transmission jack, and drank the beers Ray kept taking from the porch cooler. When Michael informed them that he needed to get home, they worked until nearly 3 p.m. He wiped his hands with a rag and stated, "Susan probably has dinner started." Ray gave a nod. "Inform her that I said hey." Michael returned by car. At 3:17 p.m., a Ford F-150 rattled over gravel roads before entering Lot 14. The driveway did not contain the silver Honda Accord. The trailer was pitch black. Expecting to hear the TV, Natasha's voice, or the stovetop cooking, he unlocked the door and entered the room. Silence. He called out, "Susan!" No response. He went through the trailer on foot. The kitchen had been cleaned. Breakfast dishes were still on the drying rack. The living room had no one in it. He went through the bedrooms. The room Natasha had was neat, her drawings pinned to the walls, and her bed was made. The bedroom he and Susan shared was exactly as he had left it that morning. He got the closet open. Susan's attire was still present. The duffel bag he had seen her with a few days ago, her boots and her winter coat were gone, but most of her belongings remained. He noticed something strange in Natasha's room. On her pillow was Charlie, her favorite stuffed bear, that she carried everywhere. She didn't leave without it ever. He turned it over in his hands, then put it back on its base. Michael opened the refrigerator in the kitchen. The door was magnetized with a handwritten note from Susan on torn notebook paper. "Michael, I can no longer do this. I am bringing Natasha. Susan, don't come looking for us." He went over it twice. Then he opened a beer and rolled it up in his fist before putting it on the counter. For an hour, he sat on the couch and stared at the blank TV screen. As dusk fell over the trailer at 6:30 p.m., Margaret Hayes called. All afternoon, she had tried to call Susan on her cell phone, but it kept going to voicemail. His voice was flat when Michael answered the landline. He stated, "She's gone." "What does it mean to be gone?" "She left, grabbed Natasha, and said she couldn't continue like this." Margaret's stomach dropped. "Where did she go, Michael?" A note read, "Horrible if I know." Did not specify where. "Have you contacted the police?" Michael laughed, a brief sour sound. "I shouldn't. She went off by herself. The note indicates that." Margaret tightened her grip on the phone. "I'm coming over, Michael." Dressed to impress that evening with her husband by his side, she drove to Beckley and arrived at the trailer shortly after 8 o'clock. With no expression on his face, Michael let them in. On the counter, the note remained. Margaret looked around the trailer. After reading it, she looked around the trailer. Everything seemed off. While Susan's makeup bag was in the bathroom, her purse was gone. The closet still held her favorite coat. The bed held Natasha's bear. "She wouldn't leave Charlie behind," Margaret said while pointing to the stuffed animal. Michael shrugged and said, "Natasha never goes anywhere without this. Perhaps she forgot." Your child's favorite toy is not forgotten." She might have been hurrying. Margaret faced him as she turned. "Where is her vehicle?" "I do not know. She took it." "Have you sought them out?" Michael's eyes became hard. "She is a mature woman. She made a decision." Margaret was ready to yell. She contacted the Beckley Police Department using the landline in the trailer. Responding, a dispatcher requested her information and promised to dispatch an officer. Officer Jason Trent, a young patrolman in his late 20s, arrived at 9:42 p.m.
He went through the trailer with a flashlight, read the note, and took statements from both Michael and Margaret. "Any indications of difficulty?" he inquired. Michael gave a headshake. "No, she left just now." Officer Trent looked over at Margaret. "Ma'am, has your sister ever mentioned wanting to leave?" Margaret hesitated. "She was dissatisfied, but she would not simply vanish without telling me." "Did she possess funds? Have access to money?" "Not a lot. Perhaps a few hundred?" In his report, Officer Trent noted everything. He explained that the police could not do much if there was no evidence of a crime. Even if there was a note, the fact that an adult left with her child did not warrant an immediate investigation. If Susan did not contact him within 48 hours, he suggested filing a missing persons report. Margaret felt her chest getting tighter. "By that time, my sister could be anywhere." "Ma'am, I understand, but legally, she is an adult who left on her own accord." Michael remained silent as he stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. At 10:30 p.m., Officer Trent left, promising to submit his report to the detectives. That night, Margaret slept on the couch in the trailer. She kept thinking about the bear that was sleeping on Natasha's bed, the jacket in the closet, and the makeup bag in the bathroom, and all of the little things that Susan would have brought if she really wanted to start from scratch somewhere new. Margaret submitted an official missing persons report to the Beckley Police Department the following morning, March 13. The data were recorded by the clerk. Susan Marie Carter, 41, is a white woman with brown hair, blue eyes, and about 5'4" and 130 pounds. Natasha Lynn Carter is a 10-year-old white female with blue eyes, blonde hair, and approximately 48 pounds. Vehicle: silver 1998 Honda Accord with the license plate WV4729L in West Virginia. The report was recorded and entered into the database of the National Crime Information Center. It then sat because there was no indication of kidnapping or foul play, and it was just another domestic case. A woman leaves her husband and her daughter and vanishes into the vast American landscape where people vanish on a daily basis and are rarely found unless they wish to be. On March 15th, Michael Carter gave one interview to the Register-Herald, a local newspaper. He revealed to the reporter that Susan had been planning to leave for weeks, that she had been dissatisfied, and that he had attempted to work things out. He stated that he wished for her safety wherever she was. He stated that he was missing his daughter. The article appeared on page 6, a brief tale that is simple to miss. "Beckley woman, daughter missing after apparent departure" was the headline. Margaret Hayes continued to call the police, submit updates requests, drive through Beckley and the surrounding counties, stopping at gas stations and motels to show people pictures of Susan. Likewise, Natasha. They had gone unnoticed. Michael Carter stopped returning Margaret's calls within 2 weeks after the silver Honda Accord had vanished as completely as its occupants. The case was filed as a voluntary disappearance by April 2000. Overworked and underfunded, the assigned detectives moved on to other cases, including domestic assaults, drug busts, and the daily grind of small-town law enforcement. For the majority of Beckley, Susan and Natasha were just names in a file and faces in a database. However, Margaret, she never stopped looking, and a single thought kept coming back to her in the back of her mind like a drumbeat. She refused to abandon the bear. Susan and Natasha Carter remained absent throughout Capitol for Busk and Disastendis March in April 2000. Beckley's surroundings cold mountains remained. The silver Honda Accord appeared to have dissipated into the vast American road network like smoke in the air. As the morning was still frosty, Margaret Hayes rejected the passive stance taken by the police department. If she would search, not they would. Margaret led the first volunteer search on March 16, 4 days after the disappearance. She used her credit card and her limited savings to print 500 flyers at Kinko's in Princeton. 2 images were shown in the flyers: Natasha, her school picture from the fall of 1999, wearing a purple sweater and holding a hesitant smile, and Susan, whose photo from the previous Christmas shows her with only a fleeting smile. Susan Carter, 41, who was last seen in the photos in 10. Natasha Carter on March 12, 2000, she was last seen. Silver, 1998 Honda Accord, Beckley, West Virginia. License number WV4729L. Margaret Hayes or Beckley PD can be contacted. Frank, Margaret's husband, helped your tape flyers to gas station bulletin boards, telephone poles, and convenience store windows. In a 50-mile radius, they drove through Beckley, Oak Hill, Princeton, and Bluefield. Margaret asked the same questions each and every time they stopped. Have you seen this woman, this young child, or this automobile? The responses were always the same. No. Sorry, no. The case was given to Detective Roy Caldwell at the Beckley Police Department. He was a career cop with thin hair and a constant look of exhaustion. He was 48 years old. He had worked on homicides, drug cases, domestic disputes, and the entire range of small-town criminal activity. A note from his supervisor and the Carter disappearance were on his desk. Low priority, likely voluntary departure. Caldwell looked over the file, Officer Trent's initial report, and the note that Susan allegedly left behind. He knew the information. The majority of adult missing person cases with notes were exactly what they appeared to be. People start over. But this one felt incomplete. The makeup bag in the bathroom, the toy bear left behind, the sister's insistence that Susan would never leave without contacting her. All of these things. Caldwell drove to the trailer park on Dry Branch Road on March 18th and knocked on Lot 14's door. With a beer in his hand, Michael Carter responded wearing sweatpants and a flannel shirt. Despite the fact that it was only 10 o'clock in the morning, he allowed Caldwell inside without any resistance. Officer Trent's description of the trailer was inaccurate. The kitchen counter was lined with empty beer cans. The sink held unwashed dishes. The smell of old food and cigarette smoke permeated the air. Michael was cross-legged against the counter while Caldwell was seated at the small kitchen table. "Mr. Carter," Caldwell began, grabbing a notebook from his bag. "I need to inquire about the disappearance of your wife." Michael blinked. "I already disclosed everything to the other cop." "I understand that, but I'd like to hear it again." Michael retold the same story. He had left early on Sunday to help Ray Dawkins with his truck. Susan and Natasha were gone when he returned home around 3 o'clock p.m. He found the note. He assumed that Susan had fulfilled her threats to leave in the end. "Threats?" Caldwell wrote a question. She had stated for months that she wanted to leave. Stated that she was unhappy. Alleged that I treated her improperly. Michael spoke without emotion and voice. "Have you? What did I do?" "Give her credit." Michael clenched his jaw. "She got a roof from me. Food. I didn't swindle. Did not wander. That's on her if that wasn't enough." Caldwell stayed silent. "Then neighbors said they heard loud arguments and things breaking." "We disagreed. What then?" "Every couple fights." "Your wife's cries were heard by some neighbors," they said. "Your daughter as well." Michael's face became hard. "Are you making a claim against me?" "I'm trying to figure out what went wrong." "You already know what I mean." "Happened. She fled." After I'm making a note, Caldwell changed course. "On March 12th, where were you from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m.? Where Ray Dawkins is. As previously stated, can he confirm that?" "Yes, contact him." Did Caldwell. He drove to Ray Dawkins' house later that afternoon, a sagging house with a yard full of old appliances and car parts. Michael's story was confirmed by Ray without hesitation as he wiped the grease from his hands with a rag. Michael had arrived at about 10:30 a.m. and stayed until about 3 p.m. They had brewed beer, worked on the transmission, and talked football.
Ray even showed Caldwell the Chevy Silverado's transmission, which was still partially deconstructed in the driveway. Caldwell inquired because that day he seemed upset. Ray blinked. No, exactly as before. Waited until he was about to leave to tell his wife that she was leaving. Said something along the lines of, "Susan probably has dinner ready." That's all. Everything was recorded by Caldwell. The time frame was short, but it was plausible. Suppose Susan had left the 7-Eleven by 10:31 a.m., and Michael was at Ray's by 10:30. So unless Michael had done something prior to going to Ray's, there wasn't much overlap. However, that didn't fit the evidence. At 10:31, Susan was still alive and driving in the 7-Eleven video. A neighbor who had passed by Ray's around 10:45 a.m. had seen Michael's truck. The excuse stood. Caldwell wrote down his findings when he returned to the station. The subject's alibi for the time of disappearance has been confirmed by Michael Carter. Ray Dawkins, a witness, provides no physical evidence to support foul play in the house. Note indicates that the departure was voluntary. He submitted the report, but the unease persisted. Although gut feelings did not build cases, Michael Carter's demeanor, flatness, and lack of concern bothered him. Margaret Hayes had enlisted the help of a dozen volunteers, friends, church members, and co-workers from the hospital where she was a nurse by the end of March. They organized weekend searches, checking rest stops, motels, and campgrounds on the roads between Beckley and the state borders. They looked for the silver Honda as they walked along the New River's banks. Nothing was discovered. There were no tire tracks, no debris, and no witnesses who claimed to have seen a woman and a child who matched the descriptions. Margaret went to the 7-Eleven on Harper Road on March 25th and spoke with Derek Palmer, the clerk who had sold Susan Skittles and cigarettes. Derek remembered her clearly. He described Susan's hands shaking as she took the change and how nervous she appeared. Margaret inquired if he had observed anyone following Susan, observing her. Derek gave a headshake. He stated that she was alone. Only she and the young child are in the back seat. What did she say about her destination? Ma'am, no. Only paid and then left. Margaret inquired if he had informed the police. Derek said that nobody had inquired. She gave Detective Caldwell his contact information the following day and wrote it down. It was added to the file by Caldwell. But he did not respond right away. He was dealing with 3 additional cases, one of which was a homicide in Oak Hill. Carter's case, officially a missing person without any evidence of a crime, the priority list kept getting lower and lower. Margaret requested Susan's bank records at the beginning of April. On March 10, the tax refund, a $180 withdrawal, was the last transaction. Nothing since then. There were no checks cashed, debit card purchases, or ATM withdrawals. Susan's account sat untouched, $4,317 remaining. She didn't leave any money behind for someone who was supposed to be starting a new life. Margaret pointed this out to Caldwell. If she exists, and how is she procuring food while on the run? Gas? Where does she reside? Caldwell did not respond. Perhaps she had money that we are unaware of. $240 was hers. She told me. That's not enough to disappear for a month, so I know that. People make less money. Margaret raised her voice. My sister would not simply disappear. She experienced an event. Caldwell put the file on his desk. To the end, Mrs. Tay, I understand your frustration, but without evidence of a crime, there's only so much we can do. We checked buses, shelters, and hospitals. We have her information entered into national databases. If she's out there and wants to be found, she'll turn up. We can't do anything either if she doesn't want to be found. That day, Margaret felt empty as she left the police station. She cried as she sat in her car in the parking lot, gripping the steering wheel with such force that her knuckles turned white. Frank drove her home after finding her there 20 minutes later. Media interest had vanished by May 2000. One issue of the Register-Herald article that follows up on page 8, after 2 months, Beckley's mother's daughter remains missing. It mentioned Margaret's tireless efforts, the volunteer searches, and the police department's claim that the case remained open. However, the article also cited an unidentified departmental source as saying, all indications suggest Mrs. Carter voluntarily left. The piece was published on May 12th. There was no new information called in. Margaret decided to hire a private investigator in June. Leonard Walsh was a retired state trooper in his 60s who now ran a small Charleston agency. In addition to his fees, he charged $75 per hour. To pay him, Margaret and Frank mortgaged their home. Walsh's case was for 3 weeks. He reined in Michael Carter, who refused to let him into the trailer and answered questions through a door that was only half open. He talked to teachers at Beckley Elementary, as well as Ray Dawkins, Carol Jenkins, and Derek Palmer. He looked over call logs. The phone that Susan owned had been turned off or destroyed. On March 12th at 10:47 a.m., its last ping was close to a cell tower on Route 3 eastbound, shortly after the disappearance. Then there was silence. The gloomy final report that Walsh presented to Margaret at the beginning of July. There is no evidence of wrongdoing and no witnesses to abduction or violence. Despite NCIC alerts, the subject's vehicle has not been located. There is no activity in the financial records. The subject is either dead or intentionally living off-grid. Recommend ongoing database monitoring and periodic appeals to the media. Margaret reviewed. Frank held her by the shoulder as she read the report in her kitchen. She put it down when she was done and looked out the window at the trees that were behind their house. Margaret said quietly, "She's not living off-grid. She has died." Frank did not challenge. The volunteer searches had ended by the end of 2000. People got back to living their lives. Until they were torn down or covered by new advertisements, the flyers rotted on telephone poles, their ink smearing as the rain poured down on them. Caldwell moved as a detective. On to the next case. At the Beckley Police Department, the Carter file was marked open and inactive in a cabinet in the basement. Margaret went on by herself. She would drive to Beckley every month and walk through the places where Susan might have gone. She would stop at gas stations, show the pictures, and inquire if anyone had seen them. Every time the responses were the same. No. Sorry. No. Margaret persuaded the local television station, WVSA, to air a segment commemorating the disappearance's one-year anniversary in 2001. The program aired the segment on March 12, 2001 at 6 p.m. It provided photos of Susan and Natasha, a plea for information interview with Margaret, and a brief statement from the Beckley Police Department stating that the case remained open. 4 calls were made to the tip line. 3 were jokes. One of them was a woman who claimed to have seen Susan in a Tennessee Walmart, but it turned out to be someone else. On the 2-year anniversary, in 2002, no media outlet reported on the story. Margaret held a vigil at the Raleigh County Courthouse on her own, holding a candle and a sign with photographs of Susan and Natasha. 5 people were there. Rain fell. Detective Caldwell officially reclassified the case on April 15, 2002. The new label, Cold Case, refers to a presumed voluntary departure. Along with dozens of other unsolved cases, the file was moved to a storage room in the basement of the police station. 6 months later, Caldwell resigned. He read through the Carter file page by page one last time. He still didn't think Susan had left on her own accord. But faith was not evidence. He closed the file, returned it to the box, and left.
In the meantime, Michael Carter continued to live in the trailer on Dry Branch Road. He drank at Smokey's bar, collected disability checks, and rarely talked about his wife and daughter who were missing. He would always respond in the same way when asked. She fled. I only know that. He began dating Brenda Kowalski, a waitress at the diner on Harper Road in 2003. She and he had moved into the trailer together in 2004, but they got married in 2005. Michael never made an offer, and Brenda never inquired about Susan. Carol Jenkins, Susan's neighbor who had witnessed her departure on that Sunday morning, left in 2006. She gave Margaret a hug when she stopped by Margaret's Princeton home before she left. Carol said, her eyes wet, "I wish I'd done more. I ought to have contacted someone, ought to have forced them to listen." Margaret was by her side. Despite your efforts, neither of them believed you. 10 years after her disappearance, Susan was back in 2010, and Natasha Carter were names that the majority of Beckley residents had never heard of. A storage facility had taken the place of the trailer park on Dry Branch Road after it was sold and demolished. On the outskirts of town, Michael Carter had moved into a small house. He was 54 years old, grayer, heavier, and suffering from worse back pain. He rarely ventured outside. Margaret Hayes, who is now 58 years old, still displayed Natasha and Susan's pictures on her mantle. She lit a candle on March 12 each year. She inquired of the Beckley Police Department each year by calling. Updates were available. The response was the same each year: sorry, no, no. Margaret was told she had breast cancer in 2015. She had surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation treatments. She made it through, but it made her weaker and slower. Frank took a break to look after her. They occasionally discussed Susan, Natasha, and possible events, but their conversations always ended the same way. Margaret never stopped believing that her sister was out there, waiting to be discovered, even when she was silent, grieving, or in the terrible state of not knowing. I just didn't think she would live to see it. And it appeared that she was correct. For 24 years, the case files became stale. The flagged but inactive reports of missing people remained in databases. From coast to coast, Susan Marie Carter's silver Honda Accord was listed in stolen vehicle registers. Every year, computer systems generated and sent out alerts. However, until a backhoe blade struck metal beneath the red clay of an old coal loading site in October 2024, nobody was paying attention, and the secret that the Earth had been keeping was finally exposed. Between the years 2000 and 2024, memory was slowly and steadily eroded like water over stone, leaving only the sharpest edges. In Beckley's collective consciousness, Susan and Natasha Carter became ghosts. Their names are occasionally mentioned on online forums for true crime, faces on out-of-date websites for missing people that no one visits anymore. The world changed, technology progressed. Each coal mine was shut down individually. Bulldozing and paver work were done on Dry Branch Road's trailer park. Over. A silver Honda Accord sat unmoved in the red Appalachian clay, 3 feet below everything else. Michael Carter became a reclusive senior as he got older. He was 64 years old in 2020. Due to the mining injury that had never fully healed, his back was permanently bent. After 14 years of marriage, his second wife, Brenda, left him in 2018, citing his drinking, his temper, and his refusal to talk about anything that mattered. He survived on disability by living alone in a small rental house on the eastern edge of Beckley. Checks and odd jobs from time to time. He only ever went out to buy cigarettes and beer at the corner store. Neighbors described him as unfriendly. Kurt was the kind of person who shut the blinds and kept his past hidden. In 2022, Margaret Hayes turned 70. The breast cancer had returned twice, each time beaten back by treatments that left her weaker. She was left to fend for herself after Frank passed away in 2019 from a heart attack in the house they had shared for 43 years. The photos of Susan and Natasha were still on the faded but unmoved mantle. She lit a candle on March 12 each year. The flame only burned each year. She stopped contacting the police. It was pointless. The detectives who had worked on the case were either retired or deceased, and it had been unsolved for more than 2 decades. The new generation of police officers was unfamiliar with Susan or Natasha Carter. They thought of the case as a basement file or a database entry that sent out automated alerts that no one ever read. But Margaret never gave up hope. In the quiet of her living room, in the long evenings when grief felt heaviest, she'd talk to Susan as if her sister could hear. "I haven't forgotten you. You will never leave me." October 2024 was gray and cold. Permits, environmental reviews, and overspending had caused the construction project at the old coal loading station on Beckley's eastern edge to be delayed for months. But on October 8th, the team finally began excavating. It was planned to be a shopping center, a promise of economic revival in a town that lost its core with the collapse of the coal industry. The excavator operator, Tommy Briggs, was 34 years old, a Beckley native who had left high school and worked in construction. As a child, he had played in the derelict rail yards, and he knew the stories about the former loading station, the men who had worked there, and the coal that had once flowed through like black gold. He was well versed in the area. Now it was just weeds and dirt that needed to be scraped, pristine, and rebuilt. His backhoe's blade struck something solid at 8:52 a.m. The metallic clang was heard all over the place. Briggs stopped, imagining that he had hit a rusted rail tie or buried machinery. But when he got down and brushed the clay away, he saw paint, automotive paint in silver, and beneath the mud a distinctive shape license plate. When it happened, his first thought was that someone had dumped a stolen car decades ago. But when he summoned his foreman and they began meticulously excavating the area around the vehicle, the shape that came out was incorrect.
The vehicle was not damaged. It was deliberately buried in a trench and positioned horizontally. The roof was crushed, but not by impact, but from the weight of years of earth falling on it. The West Virginia State Police arrived around 10 a.m. The location was a crime scene by noon. The forensic team proceeded carefully and slowly. They weren't able to simply remove the vehicle using chains. Too excessive danger of destroying evidence. Instead, they lifted it with hydraulic jacks. Every position of debris and each layer of soil, inch by inch, was recorded. After being meticulously cleaned, the license plate was photographed on the spot, WV4729L. Within minutes, the results of a records check arrived. In the name of Susan Marie Carter, missing since March 12, 2000 as reported. Detective Megan Cross, 38, was the lead investigator. She was a state police detective who had been transferred to the cold case unit 2 years earlier. When she pulled the file from the archives that afternoon, she discovered that she had never heard of Susan Carter. Observing a case that had been literally and metaphorically buried for nearly a quarter of a century. On October 10, the Honda Accord was brought to the State Forensic Laboratory in Charleston. The examination lasted 3 days. What they found confirmed the worst. 2 sets of bones. The child in the back seat and the adult in the driver's seat. Denim, synthetic fabric, and the remnants of a blouse with a floral print still clung to the bones. The adult's left wedding ring was photographed, cataloged, and compared to photographs taken from the initial case file. Under layers of sediment that had permeated through rusted seams for decades, it matched Susan Carter's ring. In the back seat, the pink backpack was located. The name, stitched in purple thread, was still legible despite the rotted nylon. Natasha. The pages of a small notebook were swollen, stuck together, and tucked away in a corner. There was a Charlie stuffed bear inside, its fur matted with clay, but it was Charlie. DNA was extracted from the bones, teeth, and femur and marrow fragments. They were contrasted with samples that Margaret Hayes had provided in the year 2000 and kept in the case file specifically for this purpose. On October 15th, the results were returned.
The chance of a match is 99.97%. Natasha Lynn Carter and Susan Marie Carter were found dead. But the mechanical analysis was what turned the tragedy into a murder. The Honda Accord's exterior rear doors had been welded shut. Crude, quick, but effective welds. The forensic engineer who looked at them made a note of it in his "weld in accordance with industrial welding equipment," says the report. The fact that doors can't be opened from inside is evidence of deliberate confinement. The front door appeared to have been forced shut. After being jammed, the lock mechanism on the driver's side had been reinforced with wire. Despite being in good shape, the windows couldn't be rolled down. Several wires had been cut under the dashboard to disable the electrical system. Soil analysis was the final piece. Diesel fuel was present in trace amounts in the clay that surrounded the vehicle, and lubricant for heavy machinery. The burial occurred between March and April 2000, according to isotope dating. Someone with access to an excavator or backhoe dug the trench, buried the vehicle inside, and this was consistent with the timeline of the disappearance. After that, they would let nature take care of the rest, covering it up for 24 years with kudzu saplings. Detective Cross drove to Princeton on October 18, 2024, and knocked on Margaret Hayes' door. Margaret slowly opened it, her hands shaking and her thin, pale face. Cross's introduction. Margaret's legs nearly gave out as she introduced herself and displayed her badge. Before Cross spoke, she was aware. She was aware. We located them. Cross spoke softly. Margaret opened her mouth with her hand. She did not weep. No, not yet. She merely gave a sluggish nod, as though confirming something she had always suspected. Where? She spoke softly. Beckley was buried on a former manufacturing site. For how long? Since 2000. They had been there all along. Margaret sat down on the step of her porch. She was sat next to Cross.
Neither spoke for a long time. The smell of wood smoke and chilly rain was carried by the October wind as it moved through the trees. Margaret finally found her voice. "She didn't leave. I knew. Yes, lady." "How were they killed?" Cross was hesitant. "We are still looking into it, but there was no accident." Despite the onset of tears, Margaret fixed her eyes on her. "Is it true that it was Michael?" "We are looking into every lead." "He was it." Margaret spoke coldly and with certainty. "He was always to blame." On October 20th, the news spread across the nation. MSNBC, Fox, and CNN. The story was published by every major media outlet, and the 24-year-old cold case was solved. Missing West Virginia bodies, mother and daughter, were discovered buried. Beckley was relegated to the background. The community's reaction this time was one of horror and shock. The image of the silver Honda Accord covered in rust and clay became ingrained in people's minds. Natasha's former classmates paid tribute to her on social media. The guilt of not speaking up decades ago was expressed by former neighbors. Also, in the quiet corners of true crime forums where amateur investigators had discussed Susan and Natasha's case for years, they had been correct. It had never been someone's choice to disappear. A task force was assembled by Detective Cross. Modern investigative methods were used to pull, digitize, and examine the case file from 2000. Every witness was recontacted, re-examination of every piece of evidence. Additionally, a name that had been on the suspect list since the beginning was circled in red at the top. October 22, 2024, Michael Joseph Carter. An investigation that had been inactive for 24 years reached its pinnacle at Charleston's West Virginia State Police Headquarters. Printouts, photographs, and a timeline that covered the period from March 2000 to the present covered the walls of a conference room with no windows where Detective Megan Cross sat. Across from her sat forensic analysts, state prosecutors, and a young FBI liaison assigned to provide technical support. On the whiteboard behind them, written in blue primary suspect, is Michael Joseph Carter. Methodically, the evidence chain was being constructed. The foundation, Michael's history of domestic violence, the neighbors' reports of screaming and crying, and the suspiciously convenient alibi were all provided in the 2000 case file. However, alibis from 2000 required fresh examination. Cross sent 2 detectives in search of Ray Dawkins. When Susan and Natasha went missing, the man who claimed to be Michael was at his house working on a truck. In a nursing home, they found him. 71 years old, confined to a wheelchair following a stroke 3 years ago, lives in Oak Hill. His recall was hazy, but when investigators showed him pictures from 2000 and inquired about March 12th, he became distant. He spoke slowly. "Michael Carter. Yes, I do remember. That morning he stopped by." "When is it?" Ray was hesitant. "I'm not sure. It has been a long time. It says 10:30 a.m. in the report. Does that make sense?" Ray's eyes got blurry. "Maybe. Or perhaps it came later. Hell, I have no recollection. I was half sober. The period prior to that?" The detective leant forward. "Ray, this is crucial. Is it possible that Michael arrived after 10:30? It's noon." Ray's hands were gnarled and shaking as he looked at them. "Might have been. My timekeeping was off." The statement was written down. Although it did not completely disprove the alibi, it did raise questions about it. There was a 4-hour window between Susan leaving the 7-Eleven at 10:31 a.m. and Michael arriving at Ray's house, if Michael hadn't arrived by noon. A lot of time. Back in Charleston, the vehicle itself was the primary focus of forensic teams. Electron microscopy was used to analyze the welds on the back doors. The metallurgy was similar to industrial welding rods, which are often used in construction and demolition projects. Cross retrieved employment records for Michael Carter from 2000. He had been disabled and unemployed in March that year, but records showed that he had worked for Tri-State Demolition briefly in 1999. Heavy equipment. Cross got in touch with the company, which was long gone, but still had archived records in a warehouse in Charleston. They found something after searching through boxes of invoices and equipment logs for 2 days. Michael Carter had rented a Caterpillar backhoe for personal use on March 14, 2000, 2 days after Susan and Natasha vanished. His handwriting was on the rental agreement. On March 16th, the machine was returned, covered in red clay. Cross held steady as she took a picture of the document, but her heart was racing. This was the connection they needed. The soil samples from Michael's 2000 residence at the trailer park on Dry Branch Road were compared to those from the burial site. The composition of the clay was identical. According to the testimony of geologists, the specific mineral content, which was low in calcium carbonate and high in iron oxide, was consistent with the soil that was found in a small portion of Raleigh County, and included both the location of the trailer park and the burial site. Cross obtained a search warrant for Michael on October 28th. Carter currently lives in a modest rental house on Baker Street in Beckley. When the entry team arrived at 6 a.m., Michael opened the door before they could use it. In stained boxer shorts, gray hair, disheveled, and blurry eyes, he stood in the doorway. "What on earth is this?" he mumbled. "Joseph Michael Carter. A search warrant has been issued for this property." He did not fight. While officers went through his house, he was left to stand on the front lawn in bare feet, meticulously cataloging and photographing. Buried beneath tarps and old paint cans in the garage, they came across a metal toolbox, a spool of welding wire, gloves with old burn marks on them, and a welding mask. The composition of the wires was consistent with the door welds on the Honda Accord. That afternoon, Michael was brought to the station for questioning. He sat in interview room 2, a small room with a metal table that was bolted to the floor and beige-painted cinder-block walls. With a file folder in front of her, Detective Cross sat across from him. Dale Fitzpatrick, Michael's public defender, sat next to him, an exhausted man in his 50s. Cross took a picture off the table and opened the folder.
The silver Honda Accord that is being removed from the excavation site, rusted and covered in clay. "Do you know this?" Cross inquired. Michael gave it a cursory glance before turning away. "That is Susan's vehicle. On October 8th, we discovered it buried at the previous coal loading site on East Main." Michael remained silent. Cross placed a second picture in the wrong place. "The driver's seat holds the skeletal remains. That's your spouse, Mr. Carter, Susan, and Natasha, your daughter, was hidden in the back seat." Michael's expression did not shift. He leaned back in his chair after staring at the picture with his jaw clenched. "I was unaware that they were present. Neither knew nor remembered. I had no idea." Cross placed the rental agreement on the table in a crosshatch. 14th of March, 2000. "A backhoe was rented by you. What was the purpose?" Michael turned to look at his lawyer. Fitzpatrick leaned over and spoke in a whisper. Michael gave a headshake. "I can't recall." "You are not. Remember renting heavy equipment 2 days after your daughter and wife vanished? 24 years ago?" Cross grabbed a different document. "The receipt for the welding equipment. In January 2000, you purchased welding supplies. You were welding what?" "I took on odd jobs. Changed things. Changed things like the doors on cars." With his hands folded into fists and resting on the table, Michael said, "I need an attorney." "You have an attorney. A superior one." The conversation ended. Despite Cross's knowledge that they were close, Michael was given his release pending additional investigation. The evidence from forensics was accumulating. The soil match, the welding equipment, and the rental agreement were all coincidental, but taken together, they formed a narrative. Forensic analysts made a breakthrough on November 3rd. Fabric fibers were discovered beneath layers of sediment in the Honda's trunk. The fibers were looked at and compared to work gloves that are commonly used in construction and demolition. The DNA that was extracted from the fiber's skin cells revealed a male profile.
The profile was compared to a Michael Carter sample during the execution of the search warrant. The chance of a match is 99.8%. Cross felt the weight of 24 years pressing down on him as he stood in the lab and stared at the report. From beneath the earth, Susan and Natasha had cried out, and now someone was listening. Michael Joseph Carter was detained at his home on November 12, 2024. He was accused of abusing a corpse, kidnapping, and 2 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest made headlines across the nation. Michael was seen in the footage, now 68 years old. Aged, his face blank as he is led from his home in handcuffs. Reporters yelling at him to answer questions. From her Princeton living room, Margaret Hayes observed the arrest on the news, wept as she sat by herself with her hands folded in her lap. Not from elation. The terrible confirmation that everything she'd believed for 24 years was true would bring relief later, if at all. She was not abandoned by her sister. The man who had killed her had left the scene, got married again, and lived, while Natasha and Susan were sealed in darkness. On February 10, 2025, the trial began in Raleigh County Circuit Court. The courtroom had a full house. The gallery was full of reporters. Margaret's hands were shaking as she sat in the front row, holding a picture of Susan and Natasha. Michael sat expressionless at the defense table in a suit that didn't fit right. Under the direction of Assistant State Prosecutor Ellen Vargas, the prosecution constructed their case methodically. They presented the timeline on the first day. At 10:31 a.m., Susan and Natasha were last seen at the 7-Eleven. Michael's justification is murky, and he could have arrived at Ray Dawkins' house as late as noon. Forensic experts provided testimony on day 2. The soil analysis, the DNA on the work gloves, and the welds on the car doors. For the jury, every piece of evidence, including photographs and simplified translations of technical language, was shown on screens. According to the testimony of the medical examiner, there were no signs of blunt force trauma on the remains, suggesting carbon monoxide poisoning or asphyxiation. A hose feeding fumes into the sealed interior of the vehicle had been rigged into the exhaust system of the vehicle. The courtroom fell silent. Margaret stifled a sob by covering her mouth. The prosecution called Carol Jenkins, who is now 78 and lives in Florida, via video link on day 5. She testified about Susan's bruises and Natasha's fear when she waved goodbye to her the morning Susan drove off. Carol voiced, "I should have stopped her," breaking, "I should have known." Margaret took the stand on day 7. She talked about Susan's plans to leave, the cash in the amount of $240, and the duffel bag that was hidden in the trunk. She described the phone call 2 weeks before the disappearance. "I just need 2 more weeks," said Susan, her voice shaking. Margaret maintained her steady tone until the prosecutor inquired about Natasha's bedside stuffed bear. The judge witnessed her breaking down in tears. The judge called a recess. The defense argued that the prosecution was building a case on coincidence and tragedy, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and that the evidence was circumstantial, that Michael had rented the backhoe for legitimate work, that the DNA could have been transferred innocently. However, the prosecution dealt their final blow on day 9. The investigators had obtained the carrier's archived cell phone records from March 2000. His phone had rang at 11:47 a.m. on March 12 from a cell tower near the grave, directly rebutting his claim that he had arrived at Ray Dawkins' house by 10:30. The defense had no answer. The jury returned on February 24, 2025, after 3 hours of deliberation. The verdict was read aloud as the foreman stood in the courtroom. In the case of Susan Marie Carter's death, Count 1 is first-degree murder. Guilty. Margaret gasped for air. Count 2, first-degree murder in Natasha Lynn Carter's death. Guilty. She did not open her eyes. Third count, kidnapping. Guilty. Kidnapping is the 4th count. Guilty. 5th count, abuse of a corpse. Guilty. Michael Carter was still seated. Michael did not respond when his lawyer put a hand on his shoulder. He looked straight ahead, as if someone else had handed down the verdict. 2 weeks later, the sentence was passed. Judith Harmon, a strict 60-year-old judge, addressed the court. "Mr. Carter, you were given the responsibility of keeping your wife and daughter safe and happy. You, on the other hand, ended their lives and buried them like rubbish. They were denied their futures by you. For 24 years, you denied their family closure. The law only allows me to serve one sentence." She gave Michael her full attention. "On both counts of murder, a life sentence without the possibility of parole is imposed." The gavel came down. Michael was escorted out. He did not turn around. Margaret was surrounded by reporters as she stood on the steps outside the courthouse. She held the same photograph of Susan and Natasha that she had carried for the past 24 years. When she spoke, her voice was calm but firm. "Justice is not healing. It doesn't help them return, but it conveys to the world that they mattered, that their lives had value, and that the person who took them from us will never again be free." She stopped and looked at the picture. "Natasha and Susan, you can relax now." On March 12, 2025, 25 years after Susan and Natasha Carter vanished, Margaret stood in Princeton Cemetery. Simple granite headstones had been placed side by side. 1959-2000, Susan Marie Carter. 1990-2000, Natasha Lynn Carter. Under the names Dear Sister, Mother, Daughter, and finally, Home. Margaret laid daisies for Susan, her favorite, and a small toy horse for Natasha on each grave. Aged knees made her knees stiff, so she knelt in the grass and touched the cold stone. She mumbled, "I never stopped looking. I never quit trying." The wind carried the scent of early spring as it moved through the trees. A bird sang somewhere in the distance. Margaret remained until the sun began to set, leaving the cemetery in long shadows. After that, she slowly stood and walked again to her vehicle. She did not turn around. No need existed. After 24 years, the earth had finally let them go.